Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association, and at the moment ASA is trying to build its membership base. Membership is just $50 Australian, and having members allows ASA to do a lot of things to support animal studies scholars, including running its biannual conference. So if you're not a member of ASA, please think about supporting the organisation. For just $50 Australian a year, you can become a member of ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now this episode of Knowing Animals has a second sponsor. This episode is also brought to you by MC Pony. Now, I talked to you about MC Pony on the show last week. Did you go to a website, veganthused.com? That's veganthused.com. You can find the link on the notes to this episode. MC Pony is a musician, she's a songwriter, she's a performer. Her songs have a lot to say about animals and animal rights. So if you like music and you like animal rights, you're sure to find something you'll like over at MC Pony's website. Now this week I'm very lucky to be joined by a very busy person, but she's kindly made time for me. Anne Fawcett is a vet and veterinary scholar. She's based at the University of Sydney and she's also a practicing vet. And today we're going to discuss Anne's recent article, Application of Fraser's Practical Ethics in Veterinary Practice and Its Compatibility with the One Welfare Framework. Now, this article appeared in the journal Animals in 2018, so it's just out. And we should also acknowledge Anne's co-authors, Siobhan Mullan and Paul McGreevy. So welcome to the podcast, Anne.
Thank you so much.
So, Anne, can you start by telling us why this work? What inspired it?
I have to go back a long way, actually. Before I studied veterinary science, I actually did study philosophy, and I was a philosophy undergraduate, and I did my honours year, and I was really keen on pursuing a career in philosophy. And I went to the career centre after that and said, what can I do with this? And they said, you can be a bank teller at ANZ. And I was kind of crushed because that wasn't, I mean, nothing wrong with ANZ, but I just didn't expect that that's what philosophy would lead me to. But I also wasn't ready to do a PhD because I thought it was somewhat circular, you know, learning sort of essentially how to live a good life, because I think that's what the point of philosophy is, and then sitting in a library for 5 years and maybe having 3 people read your PhD seemed a bit of a depressing thing. And I thought, well, I think philosophy really needs to be applied to something. And I was looking at the areas that I really wanted to work in. I'd always wanted to work with animals. So I applied for veterinary science, not thinking I was going to get in. And then I got in. So I had that philosophical background and I'm really interested in ethics, but I was interested in that before I got into veterinary science. And I guess one of the things that really fascinates me is that there's been a lot of studies that show that during the veterinary degree, moral reasoning development is actually inhibited. There's something in a veterinary degree that inhibits moral reasoning. And so I think part of that, from my own experience, is just this incredible focus on getting the diagnosis right, getting the catheter in, doing the perfect surgery, the perfect sutures, and you can forget in that process the rest of the patient. And so I think that partly that's our training and it's very career focused. But I also think that one of the sad things about being a vet is that you or I as vets could become the scariest thing in an animal's life. So sometimes I go out into the waiting room and my patient ducks under a chair and I feel terrible about that. And so one of the things that we can do, because we're in a position to help, we're also in a position to harm, inadvertently, unintentionally, but nevertheless that can have an impact on other beings. And what I was really interested in Fraser's practical ethic, he's not technically a philosopher. He's a psychologist who did a PhD in zoology and is quite an animal welfare proponent. He's at the University of British Columbia in Canada. he developed these kind of mid-level principles, if you like, for people that maybe aren't philosophers about, well, I'll tell you what his principles are. So the first is providing good lives for animals in our care, which obviously as a vet, that's fairly straightforward. To treat suffering of animals, but I also think implied in that is humans, with compassion. The other things that he suggests are being mindful of unseen harm, and that's to animals, to humans and the environment. And also, importantly, protecting the life-sustaining processes and balances of nature. And I love this because I think as vets, we try really hard and we can nail principles 1 and 2, but we tend to ignore the 3rd and 4th ones. And so the reason that I did this paper was to explore those principles and also a related concept, which is one welfare, which many people know about. And that's the concept that animal welfare and human well-being and environmental sustainability are all inextricably linked. So an example would be, you go to set up a vet practice because you want to save animals, and you build this building and inadvertently you kill 500 birds that strike the windows. So that's an unintended harm. You might generate an incredible whopping carbon footprint in, it might be on-site energy generation, or it might be off-site through the products that you use, but there might be ways to select those products that have a lower carbon footprint and therefore minimize harm. So that's what I'm really interested in with that paper.
Wonderful. So, and there's a lot in the paper that I'd like to dig into in a little bit more detail. So if we take a step back, one of your opening propositions is that there are a lot of ethical dilemmas that arise in the life of a vet. Can you give listeners a sense of the kinds of ethical dilemmas a vet might be dealing with?
Yeah, definitely. Well, there's a couple of big papers about this, but they're quite broad, and traditionally they've been framed as the sort of vet, client, animal triad, but I actually think that's a bit simplistic. But examples would be you might have an owner who wants to euthanize an animal or kill an animal really for trivial reasons, and that would be, say, they might be going on holidays and they don't want to pay for boarding, or Bernie Rowland uses the example that doesn't match the colour of the furniture anymore. I fortunately haven't met someone who's offered that excuse, but certainly because we're in a position to humanely destroy and euthanize animals, we are sometimes in a position where people ask us to do so for reasons that aren't aligned with our own values, and that can be a real dilemma, because if you do it, you lose a little bit of your soul, perhaps you're compromised. If you don't do it, what are the welfare implications? Because is that person going to try and do it themselves in a less humane way? You have to think a bit realistically about these things. So that's one example of a dilemma. And certainly when I teach students veterinary ethics, that's the one they seem to be most concerned about. But there's others too. So for example, there's conflicts of interest. Interests perhaps of the veterinarian in making an income versus the interests of the client in paying the bill or not paying the bill. And that can be a big issue, because sometimes we can't treat an animal the way we want to because there's not the funding to do so. And to what extent does one expend one's own salary doing that? And that's a dilemma that we face daily. What about wildlife that come in and they don't have an owner, and vets as private practitioners, do we foot the bill for all of that? So financial issues are actually a big thing, because veterinary practice essentially operates as a private form of medicine. But there's other dilemmas too. So another example would be if you might have a client who comes in, typically it's a female, but not always, who might bring an animal in that's injured, and you have a strong suspicion that that animal's been injured deliberately by someone else in the household, possibly who's also injuring that client. So we've got a situation where there's animal abuse, but it may be happening, and usually is, in the context of intimate partner violence or domestic family violence as well. And the risks of doing something in that case, if you're a veterinarian, what if you make a wrong report and someone is falsely accused? What if you make a report and your own safety is compromised? What if you breach that person's confidentiality and somehow endanger them? These are the things that we do struggle with. But I also think one area that hasn't been picked up so much yet is possibly a conflict in the ethics of an employer. So someone who employs a veterinarian, usually another veterinarian, but not always, and the vet themselves. And as a mentor of new graduate veterinarians, the area I see that most in is analgesia. So new graduates are pretty keen on giving pain relief, but there are some vets who are unfortunately in situations where they employ other vets and they're instructing those people underneath them not to use analgesia. Now, that's pretty rare, but it still can happen on occasion, and that's a real concern, because then there's that issue of loyalty to your employer versus, you know, this oath that we take to look after the welfare of animals. And how do you do that and not come into huge conflict or lose your job?
And why would anyone advise that? Is that because they don't believe it's necessary, or is it because it's expensive?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Actually, Carol Morgan, now deceased veterinarian, she was at the University of British Columbia and she did a PhD, and she was concerned that veterinarians, although they've identified themselves as doing great things for animal welfare, were acting in ways that were essentially against the interests of animals. So over there, she was talking about vets who were doing things like tail docking or ear cropping of dogs, for example, or tail docking dairy cattle, and also not using enough analgesia. And she did a study. She interviewed a lot of vets and asked why they weren't recommending analgesia, and a lot of them said, oh, look, the clients can't afford it, and yet they never asked the client whether the client could afford it or not. So in a sense, we're the gatekeepers of this pain relief, but we're not always doing the job in offering that. So that's one reason. So making an assumption about what people will and won't accept. There are also some people who were trained, I guess, before the era of veterinary pain relief, which is actually pretty scarily recent, and there's a belief, which is it's generally been it's been absolutely shown to be false, that if you give pain relief, you might make an animal feel too good, and then they might go and injure themselves, and that will delay healing. Now that's completely false, but there are some people who still hold that belief.
So, and you then go on to argue that these ethical dilemmas generate stress. They make the life of veterinarians stressful. Can you say something about that stress? Yeah,
well, there's been a lot of writing lately about the mental health of veterinarians, and one of the things that we think contributes to poor well-being of veterinarians is moral stress. So I guess that occurs when you act... Sorry? Shall I stop? That clock just ticked.
No. It's okay if the listeners find out that it's 3:30 on the dot.
Good to know. Moral stress is said to occur when we perhaps know the right thing to do, or we have a feeling that this is our values that we want to uphold, but circumstances force us to act in a different way. So, for example, the classic example again from Bernie Rowland is that if you are a shelter worker, you do that job probably because you really wanted to help animals, and yet for many years a lot of shelter workers spend a lot of their time euthanizing animals, doing society's dirty work, if you like. So that, he said, was a big cause of moral stress in those people. And the same for veterinarians, and I would also say veterinary nurses as well. And there's not much literature about veterinary nurses, but they're working alongside us doing exactly the same things and perhaps have less control over the situation. So I think that's an area that we need to explore pretty urgently.
That's a very good point. So you then go on to say that in your experience, the way in which vets are currently trained to think about ethical dilemmas, approach them and resolve them is inadequate. Where do you see those inadequacies?
Well, that's based on studies that have shown that repeatedly vets that are surveyed say that their training doesn't equip them to make ethical decisions. And I think veterinary ethics is a relatively new discipline. So, Bernard Rowland was teaching it at the University of Colorado in the 1970s, possibly even before then, but really it's taken a long time to take off in other places. So I think that there is some basis for that. And I guess the other thing though would be time, because you can do all the training that you want, but sometimes working your way through an ethical dilemma or ethical decision making can be time consuming. You have to think about who are all the stakeholders and what are all of their interests and what's the best path to navigate through that. And I think some people feel like training to think ethically is done in a university setting where you've got unlimited time, and then you go into practice and you're not really trained to do ethical reasoning on your feet. But I do think that people can develop practice policies that help develop shortcuts to that. So, for example, if you're in a practice that treats a lot of wildlife, you can have a policy about treating wildlife that covers most of those situations, which will save time.
So you turn to David Fraser's ethical framework and you find it interesting and relevant. So one of the things that struck me, you've already said a little bit about the framework, but one of the things that struck me about it was this call to be mindful about unseen harms. That's an interesting principle. How do you see that working, or why is that important?
Yeah, I think with unseen harms, I mean, he really means things that aren't immediately obvious, but can potentially be seen with a bit of looking. And also, I guess, in that unintended harms as well. Because, you know, a lot of ethical theories tend to focus on evaluating intentional, deliberate, controlled actions. And a lot of David Fraser's work looks at the unseen consequences of some of those actions. So, for example, let's say you want to feed a hungry town of people, and so you sow crops. But in order to do that, you have to clear the land and you wipe out a whole bunch of local species and animals. And sometimes we, in doing that, do a lot more destruction than we're even aware of, and it's very hard to reverse it. So understanding how what we do has broader impacts, not just on the patient we're trying to fix, but also on other animals as well, I think is very key. In practice, we tend to be dealing one-on-one with patients in the companion animal setting, but what we do can still have a broader impact as well.
Interesting. So what would you like to see happen more broadly with vets and them thinking about ethical issues, or at least or also feeling empowered to be able to deal with ethical problems?
Well, one thing I think that would be simple, but I don't know how people are going to find the time budget for it. I reckon what we need to be doing is having ethical rounds. You know, it's done in a lot of medical teaching settings. It's not widely done in veterinary teaching settings. There have been a couple of instances. I was involved in one of the first veterinary ethics committees, was actually run by the Lort Smith Animal Hospital, and they invited me down to have some input there. And there's subsequently been one in the US that's been set up. But I think that it's a way, talking about ethical dimensions of cases is a way of increasing people's ethical sensitivity and perhaps their ethical decision making, and they can hear how other people make decisions. So I think that's a simple, straightforward, not very costly way of improving the situation pretty immediately.
So what would that look like in practice? That's about coming together and instead of just discussing the diagnosis, also discussing the ethical dimensions to the patient and the situation.
Absolutely. So it might be that you'd be considering, say, I don't know, you might have a large dog like Bosca over there. So he's sitting in the room. You guys can't see him, but he's a 35-kilo Ridgeback Cross. He's 11 years old. He's actually fine. But if we imagine he has an osteosarcoma, which is a bone tumour, and the gold standard treatment would be probably amputation or limb sparing surgery plus minus chemotherapy, radiotherapy, those kinds of things. Whether to go ahead or not, I mean, we know we can do those things, but whether we should do those things for this particular individual is something that we need to discuss. And often it's something that the vet and the owner will discuss, and the owner will discuss with their family or extended networks. But the decision's often made fairly quickly, and you know, there can be all sorts of implications with that, and actually sitting down and talking about the interests of all the stakeholders in the situation, I think provides a nice comprehensive overview.
Wonderful. Well, Anna, I ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I'm so ready for these.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I think it was an article by Bernard Rowland, I can't remember exactly which one, in a course that Denise Russell ran at Sydney University called Humanity and Animality. many years ago.
Oh, how wonderful. Denise has been on the show. She's wonderful. And I've met Bernie. Have you met him?
I did. I actually went and spent some time with him. It was really funny because I was interviewing him on the phone and he said, and I think it was in retrospect a bit of a throwaway comment, he said, "Oh, you should come and visit." And I'm really scared of flying, but I basically got on a plane and went. And then I got there and he's like, "I can't believe you came." So we spent a bit of time together and it was really interesting. We had some very vigorous debates about all manner of issues and it was fabulous.
Oh,
yeah, I really enjoyed it. And then I went for a ride on the back of his Harley, so that was pretty exciting.
And is he still in Colorado?
He is, yes.
Yeah, great. So can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yeah, it was an essay for a subject in my first year of vet school, really, and it was called... it was based on a true story. I went to a barbecue and I was talking to someone whose dad was a vet and he said, "Oh yeah, my dad was working one day. Someone brought in an injured duck and my dad said, yep, I'll look after it." And the person left and then the dad killed the duck and they ate it. And I was kind of horrified and I just thought, what a conflict of interest. And so I wrote this essay, which was in retrospect fairly emotive, and it was called "Who Gives a Flying Duck?" And I was quite proud of that essay.
Oh, lovely. So if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, I thought about this and I feel like that's a bit of an anthropocentric question. And I would say, I'd have to say it's a cat. Her name was Gypsy. She was a stray cat who came into my life when I was a fetus, basically perched herself on my mum's belly and stayed there. And she was euthanized by our vet, Mr. S.H. Smith, as he was called, when I was in year 8 at school. And I loved that cat. She was an outdoor cat in an era where cats were the kind of, you didn't bring them inside. Things have changed now. We've got flea control and better diets and all of that sort of thing. But in those days, every cat was called a flea bag and they weren't allowed inside. And she was hit by cars on 2 occasions, but managed to survive. She was epileptic. She was pretty feisty. Wasn't the world's most affectionate cat, but was fascinated by her. And when she was euthanized, I was at school. I wasn't allowed to go to the vet that day. I vowed to myself I would never euthanize an animal. And I actually am a vet and I do euthanize animals and I'm at peace with that most of the time. But I think she had a massive influence on me, and she wasn't human and she wasn't a scholar, but I'd have to say she pushed me into the current trajectory. Yeah.
Fascinating. I was sure you were going to say Bernard Rowland, but that's okay. Poor old Bernie's
Sorry,
good.
Bernie. He's great too, but he's not a cat.
What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Well, I think there's a few things. Again, I'm not being very quick about your questions, am I? But
okay.
I want to say a couple of different things. I would say mixed disciplines for a start. I think so vet science and ag science need to mingle with medical science, and they also need to get together with the humanities and law to understand the various lenses through which we can look at human-animal interactions. I think that's so important because we miss so much with our disciplinary silos. I think sharing practical strategies is really good. Like when I think about it, how can architecture help vet clinics embrace restorative environmental design, and how can physics help us reduce our carbon footprint, and how would a social veterinary enterprise work? I think sharing strategies around that would be good. I also think academics can live with animals, and that helps them in a number of ways. First of all, there's a lot of academics out there and there's a lot of animals out there that need homes. But also I do feel like academics are often informed by human-animal interactions of their own, and you go to talks and some of the most profound insights are often from people living with animals. But I also think one other thing that we can do is vet schools can role model excellent animal husbandry. At the moment, we don't really have animals on campus because, for work health and safety, but I think, it's in our interest to promote people taking animals with them to workplaces and things like that. So I think we could be doing that really well and role modelling it. And I suppose I would also just challenge everyone out there to think about how they interact with animals. I'm someone who's very privileged to live in urban Australia. It's a fairly wealthy setting, and for me it's been a luxury to choose. I don't have to eat them, and I'm pleased about that choice, but I understand not everyone's free to make that choice. But I do think that it's really helpful to think about the ways we interact with animals, because it's not just, patting dogs and hugging kittens and things like that. We consume them, we wear them, we're entertained by them, and sometimes their part in that is a bit invisible to us. So I think understanding that and understanding its implications is crucial.
So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I guess breaking down that barrier. We are animals. So that slash there, I think we need to behave like we understand our roots. We are animals. We're just different animals. We wear clothes and use tools a bit more than they do, but ultimately we have this evolutionary, commonality, and I think understanding it would put us in a better place.
Well, Anne, what are you working on next?
Cheeky little PhD, which isn't cheeky or small at all. So I've enrolled in a part-time PhD, and I'm looking at the ethically challenging situations that are encountered by vets and nurses. And again, I want to stress that I think it's really important to think about the nurses, because a lot of the literature is about the vets, and we are just one part of a huge team that looks after animals, and we are faced with ethically challenging situations all the time. So trying to understand why and what, and whether we can change things a little bit so we can resolve some of those ethical challenges so that we can work better in alignment with our values. That's the big aim, but ask me in 7 years.
Well, we look forward to that. Meanwhile, how can people find out more about your work?
They can check out my blog, which I've been a little bit slow to update this year, but it's www.smallanimaltalk.com, or check out my page at the University of Sydney.
Yeah. And if people want to have their animal treated by a vegan vet?
Well, I would say, though, I'm vegan, but, I use drugs and products that aren't vegan. It's very hard to avoid doing that. So I guess I just don't want to mislead people. Yes, I'm vegan, but I still practice in traditional medicine. I still use drugs that are still tested on animals. That's kind of where I have to at the moment. But hopefully one day we will actually have non-animal models and be able to work without that. Yeah.
Wonderful. So, Anne, thank you so much for coming on Knowing Animals, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Are you following us on Twitter at knowing_animals, and have you liked us on Facebook at Knowing Animals? Also, someone left us a 1-star review on iTunes. When I say leave a review on iTunes, I don't mean a 1-star review, people. What's going on? So quickly jump on iTunes, counterbalance that with 6-star reviews out of 5, and help bring our ratings back up. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.